I'm Ernie Estrella from SYFY Wire, and I'm here with award-winning screenwriter John Ridley and his new comic book for Vertigo, American Way. Thanks for coming and speaking with us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
This is the sequel, actually. Your first series of American Way came through when I guess
it was Wildstorm Comics.
Yeah.
10 years ago, I'd done a couple of series for Wildstorm. They were based on other characters that had done Authority and a Warblade, and they were apparently interesting and odd enough that they wanted to offer me the opportunity to do a little world building and tell a story that I wanted to tell. And that's where the American Way came from. It was set in America, our America, real-life America, in the early 1960s, the early days of the Kennedy administration. And as the Kennedy boys, as they were called, were coming into office, they just looked around them and they felt like the real issues that are facing America are not going to be from outside our country, not from Russia or from the Cubans, but they were on the streets of America. They were racial indifference and strife and things like that. So there was a group of superheroes that were largely used as a propaganda tool. Their powers were real, but they largely fought so that people on the streets would feel safe and secure and see the might of America. And these new individuals who were coming into office felt like, well, what if one of these heroes was black? And what if we showed through his exceptionalism that anybody can accomplish anything? That was the foundation of the story, but those concepts and relations about race or integration or progressiveness, they change when you have heat vision and I've got super speed. So it was an amazing story to have the opportunity to tell. It was a story that was very well received, but 10 years ago, however anyone perceived me as a person or as a writer, my life changed a lot over the last 10 years, working on stories like 12 Years a Slave or American Crime and the TV series I just did, Gorilla. And that took me away from writing graphic novels, and it just took me in a different space. So 10 years later, Wildstorm no longer is publishing.
That's right.
But Vertigo approached me and said, hey, would you want to revisit these characters, these stories? And I absolutely did. And not only did I want to, but I'd always felt like it would be interesting to pick up that story 10 years later and look at America in a different space, in a different era. I didn't know that it would literally be 10 years later.
Yeah.
But that's not a bad thing, to be 10 years older and have a different perspective. I won't necessarily say, I hope my perspective is better. I don't know that it is, but it is grown or aged or refined itself over time. So it really is revisiting these characters with 10 years wear and tear on them, and looking at a core group of individuals. I don't want to give too much away if people haven't read that first series and choose to pick it up, but a lot happens as we approach the end. So we've got this core group who remains, and them dealing with their past, their history in present tense. It's very exciting.
Well, and then too, because you started out as a period piece, the 10 years later, when you look back even 10 years from the 60s, you look at the 70s and the 80s in a different light, with experience and with more knowledge and seeing how the world has changed or it hasn't changed. So did that also kind of color the approach for this?
Absolutely. One of the things, being here at Comic-Con, and one of the central hallmarks with science fiction or fantasy, it's being speculative, not knowing the future, not really knowing how things are going to turn out, and having that opportunity to create in that space. I love history, and there are elements of history that are clearly defined. They change a little bit depending on the prevailing culture and how they choose to write history. But we do know certain things happen and happen in a certain way, and there are certain moods or emotions. So going to that space to tell a story and say, look, here are things that we know happen, and there are parallels to our present time. One of the things that's very interesting to me is people will ask, oh, are you talking about, you're talking about then, but are you really talking about present day politics? There's not really a need to draw a sharp comparison to things that are happening now. Many of those things are very self-evident. So it's set in the past for a very particular reason. I like to explore things that we have a better sense of what happened, but we don't always know why those things happen or how they relate to immediate spaces. And the American way allows for an opportunity to look in an area that existed, that was real, but also speculate about what kinds of things could be a little bit different if there were slight changes that were introduced into a historical space.